Anybody can get paperwork. I'm gonna need you to step out of the vehicle, sir.
Officer, on what grounds are you ordering me out of my car?
I gave you a lawful order. Step out of the car now or I'll pull you out.
The sun was high and unforgiving, the kind of mid-afternoon glare that bleached the color from the sky and baked the asphalt of Northwood's main street into a shimmering ribbon of heat. Mark Carter, 48 years old, felt the warmth through the sunroof of his BMW 5 Series, a deep metallic gray that looked almost liquid in the bright light. He'd bought the car 3 months ago, a gift to himself, not a flashy indulgence, but a quiet acknowledgement of a life built on discipline and delayed gratification. 20 years in the Army, a decade building a successful logistics consulting firm from the ground up. He'd earned this. The leather smelled new. The engine hummed with a low, satisfying growl, and the suspension smoothed out the town's neglected roads. It was a good day. He was heading home from a meeting with a new client, a deal that would secure his company's finances for the next 2 years. In his rearview mirror, he saw the flash of red and blue first. It was instantaneous, appearing from a side street he'd just passed. There was no siren, just the aggressive, silent pulsing of the light bar. Mark's training kicked in before conscious thought. Check speed. He was doing 27 in a 30. Check mirrors, signal. Pull over to the right. His movements were smooth, economical. He'd been pulled over before, of course, but it was rare. His driving record was as clean as his service record. As the patrol car, a standard Ford Explorer, pulled in behind him, he cut the engine and lowered all 4 windows. Hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Wait. These were the protocols of a man who understood how an ordinary interaction could curdle into something dangerous. 2 officers emerged from the patrol car. The driver was a man in his late 20s, Officer Miller, with a short, aggressive haircut and a way of walking that was more of a swagger. His hand was already resting on the butt of his sidearm. The passenger, Officer Davies, was older, heavier, with a look of weary indifference that suggested he was just along for the ride. Miller approached the driver's side, his sunglasses masking his eyes, while Davies hung back near the rear of the BMW, his presence a silent, looming threat. Mark's heart rate was steady. He'd faced down armed insurgents in Fallujah. He would not be intimidated by a traffic stop in his own town. "License and registration," Miller said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, clipped and devoid of courtesy. "Good afternoon, officer," Mark replied, his voice calm and even. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Miller's mouth tightened into a thin line. The question was a challenge to his unstated authority. "I asked for your license and registration. Are you going to provide them or not?" "Of course," Mark said. He slowly reached for the glove compartment with his right hand, announcing his every move. "I'm reaching for my vehicle registration and proof of insurance." He retrieved the documents from a neat leather folio and handed them out the window. "My license is in my wallet. I'm going to reach into my back pocket for it now." Miller watched him, his body tense. He took the documents without looking at them, his focus entirely on Mark. Mark retrieved his wallet, removed his driver's license, and handed it over. Miller took it, finally glancing down at the items in his hand. He saw the name, Mark Carter. He saw the address, a nice part of town. He saw the registration that matched the license plate and the VIN visible through the windshield. Everything was in perfect order. But none of that was what he was really looking for. He was looking for a reason, a discrepancy that would validate the stop. "This is a nice car," Miller said, his tone shifting to one of mock curiosity. He ran a hand along the door, a gesture of ownership, of dominance. "Costs a pretty penny. You don't see too many of these around Northwood." Mark understood the implication immediately. It was an accusation wrapped in an observation. How did a man like you get a car like this? I've done all right for myself, Mark said, keeping his voice neutral. Miller smirked, a flash of smug superiority. He walked to the front of the car, then the back, inspecting it. He tapped the trunk. Where are you headed, Mark? The use of his first name was a deliberate erosion of respect. I was on my way home from a business meeting. Business meeting, Miller repeated, drawing the words out. What kind of business are you in? I own a logistics consulting company. The smirk widened. Right. Logistics. He exchanged a look with Davies, who offered a slight, complicit shrug. The performance was for him as much as for Mark. Miller walked back to the driver's window, leaning down. The smell of cheap aftershave filled the car. We've had a report of a vehicle matching this description involved in a theft over in the next county. We're just checking things out. It was a lie, and they both knew it. A boilerplate excuse. It was the oldest trick in the book for a pretextual stop. There was no report. The only suspicious activity was a black man driving a luxury car. Mark had been a military police officer for 2 years before moving into intelligence. He knew procedure. He knew the difference between a legitimate stop and a fishing expedition. This was the latter. I see, Mark said. I can assure you, officer, this vehicle has not been involved in any theft. As the registration shows, I am the owner. Anybody can get paperwork. Miller scoffed. He handed the license and registration back to Mark. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, sir. The sir was sarcastic, a verbal jab. The request was an escalation. They had no probable cause. His documents were in order. He had committed no traffic violation. A request to exit the vehicle was the next step in a search for something, anything, to justify the stop. Mark's mind raced. He could refuse. He knew his Fourth Amendment rights, but he also knew what refusing could lead to: a broken window, a forced extraction, and resisting arrest charge, a knee on his neck. He made a calculated decision. He would comply, but he would not be silent. Officer, you have my documents, which are all valid. You've cited no traffic violation. On what grounds are you ordering me out of my car? Miller's face flushed with anger. The challenge, calm and articulate, was more than he could handle. His authority had been questioned again. I gave you a lawful order. Step out of the car now, or I'll pull you out. He reached for the door handle. Davies, seeing the situation escalating, finally moved forward, his hand now also on his weapon. The sunny afternoon had suddenly turned cold. The street was quiet. There were no witnesses. It was just Mark, 2 officers, and a decision that could change the rest of his life. Mark's entire military career had been about threat assessment. Analyze the situation, weigh the variables, and choose the course of action with the highest probability of survival and success. The variables here were stark. 2 armed officers, one with a clear temper problem, on a quiet street with no one watching. His rights were on his side, but rights were an abstract concept. The cold steel of a gun barrel was not. He'd seen enough to know that being legally right could still get you killed. He unbuckled his seatbelt with a deliberate, audible click. I am complying, officer, but I am doing so under protest, he said, his voice a low, steady baritone that carried no hint of fear, only resolve. I want it noted that I do not consent to any searches of my person or my vehicle. He opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible at all times. The heat from the pavement rose through the soles of his dress shoes. Miller directed him to the rear of the BMW and told him to place his hands on the trunk. The metal was hot to the touch. As Mark leaned forward, Miller conducted a pat-down, his hands rough and invasive. He found nothing but a wallet and a phone. "What's this about, really?" Mark asked, his voice directed at Davies, who stood by silently. He was trying to find a reasonable man in an unreasonable situation. Davies just stared back, his face a blank mask of professional detachment. He wasn't going to intervene. He was part of the wall. Miller finished the pat-down and then, ignoring Mark's stated refusal to consent, opened the driver's side door and began looking inside the car. He wasn't searching for anything specific. He was looking for a pretense, a stray pill, a forgotten pocket knife, anything that could be twisted into a charge. "You have no right to search my car," Mark stated clearly. "I have not given you consent. It's a search incident to a stop." Miller grunted from inside the vehicle, the legal justification nonsensical and incorrect. "Just relax." He rummaged through the center console, then the glove compartment, finding only the owner's manual, tire pressure gauge, and a small stack of business cards. Frustration radiated from him. He had been so sure he would find something. The narrative in his head, black man, expensive car, must be a criminal, was crumbling against the bland reality of a well-maintained vehicle owned by a law-abiding citizen. After a few minutes, he pulled himself out of the car, slamming the door harder than necessary. He had found nothing. The fishing expedition had come up empty. "All right," he said, his voice tight with barely concealed rage. "We're letting you go with a warning." "A warning for what?" Mark asked, not moving from his position at the trunk. "What was the violation?" Miller walked up to him, getting into his personal space. He was shorter than Mark and had to look up slightly, which only seemed to fuel his anger. "A warning to make sure your vehicle is in proper working order. Your left taillight looked like it flickered." He poked Mark in the chest with a single finger. "Now get out of here before I change my mind." It was the final, petty assertion of dominance. Mark looked from Miller's furious face to Davies's impassive one. There was nothing more to be said here. He pushed himself off the trunk, walked to the driver's door, got in, and started the engine. He didn't look at them as he pulled away. He drove 2 blocks, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, then pulled over. His heart was finally starting to pound, the adrenaline dump hitting him now that the immediate threat was gone. He checked his taillights. They worked perfectly. The next morning, Mark Carter walked into the Northwood Police Department. He was dressed in a tailored suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He looked like the successful businessman he was, and his presence in the drab, linoleum-floored lobby was a stark contrast. He approached the front desk, where a portly sergeant sat reading a newspaper. "I'm here to file a formal complaint against 2 of your officers," Mark said, his tone polite but firm. The sergeant looked up, his expression immediately shifting from boredom to suspicion. "A complaint?" he asked, as if the concept were foreign. "Regarding what?" "An unlawful traffic stop, an illegal search of my vehicle, and unprofessional conduct. The incident occurred yesterday afternoon at approximately 2:15 p.m. on Oak Street. The officers were Miller and Davies." The sergeant sighed, a theatrical display of inconvenience. He pushed a multi-page form across the counter. "Fill this out. Be as detailed as possible." Mark took the form and sat down at a small table in the corner. For the next hour, he wrote. He didn't write with anger. He wrote with the precision of an intelligence officer filing an after-action report. He detailed the time, the location, the lack of a traffic violation, the officer's exact words, the pretextual reason for the stop, his statement of non-consent to the search, and Miller's final, false claim about a flickering taillight. He noted their badge numbers, which he had memorized. He described their appearances and demeanors. He left nothing out. When he was finished, he returned the completed form to the sergeant. The sergeant took it without looking at it and slid it into a wire basket labeled Internal Affairs. The basket was already overflowing with similar-looking forms. "What's the next step?" Mark asked. "Lieutenant Graves handles internal affairs. He'll review it. If he thinks it warrants an investigation, he'll open one. You'll be notified by mail." The sergeant's tone made it clear that the probability of an investigation was slim to none. He had already dismissed Mark. The complaint was just paperwork to be filed away, a minor annoyance in his day. Mark knew he was facing a wall, the blue wall of silence. It was a term he'd learned in the military police, a concept he'd seen in action, the unspoken code that compelled officers to protect their own, regardless of the circumstances. He was an outsider here. The sergeant, the lieutenant, the officers on the street. They were a tribe. His complaint was not a request for justice. It was an attack on one of their own, and the wall was designed to repel such attacks. He left the station that day knowing this was only the beginning. He had filed his report. He had engaged the system. Now, he would see just how deeply the rot went. 3 weeks passed. Mark checked his mail every day, but the promised notification from the Northwood Police Department never arrived. The silence was an answer in itself. It was a deliberate, bureaucratic pocket veto, a hope that he would simply give up and go away. But Mark Carter had not been trained to give up. On the 22nd day, he called the department and asked to speak with Lieutenant Graves of Internal Affairs. He was told the lieutenant was unavailable and was sent to his voicemail. Mark left a polite but firm message, referencing the date of his complaint and requesting a status update. He called again the next day, and the day after that. Each time, he was met with a different excuse. Graves was in a meeting. Graves was out of the office. Graves was on a conference call. It was a classic runaround, a tactic designed to exhaust and frustrate. On the 5th day of calling, he finally got the lieutenant on the line. "Lieutenant Graves," the voice said, thick with impatience. "My name is Mark Carter. I'm calling to follow up on a complaint I filed on. I know who you are, Mr. Carter," Graves cut in. "I have your file right here. I've reviewed it." "And what is the status of the investigation?" Mark asked, keeping his tone professional. There was a pause, followed by a sigh. "Mr. Carter, I've spoken with both Officer Miller and Officer Davies. I've also reviewed their activity logs for that day. They were conducting proactive policing in an area that has seen a recent uptick in property crime. They initiated a traffic stop based on their observation of a potential vehicle code violation, an intermittently functioning tail light. They conducted the stop in a professional manner. After a brief interaction, they issued a verbal warning and sent you on your way." The recitation was smooth, practiced. It was a summary of a report Mark knew was filled with fabrications. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, that is not what happened. There was no problem with my taillight. Your officer used it as a pretext. He illegally searched my vehicle after I explicitly withheld consent. Officer Miller's report states you were agitated and he conducted a cursory visual inspection of the vehicle for his safety, to ensure there were no accessible weapons. He never entered the vehicle," Graves countered, his voice flat and final. "Mr. Carter, we have 2 decorated officers' sworn reports versus your statement. They work this town every day. Their records are exemplary." Every word was a carefully chosen brick in the wall. The implication was clear. Mark was the one who was not credible. "So, you're saying there will be no further investigation?" "That's correct. I'm finding that the officers acted within departmental policy. I'm closing the file. You'll receive a letter to that effect in the mail." Before Mark could respond, the line went dead. Mark stood in his office, the receiver still pressed to his ear. He had expected this outcome, but the cold, dismissive reality of it was still a blow. It wasn't just that the system had failed to deliver justice, it was that the system was the injustice. It was designed to consume complaints, process them through a biased internal mechanism, and produce a preordained outcome that protected the institution at all costs. The truth did not matter. The law did not matter. All that mattered was the integrity of the blue wall. The letter arrived a week later. It was a single page, a form letter with his name typed at the top. It summarized Lieutenant Graves's findings in dry, bureaucratic language, officially exonerating Miller and Davies. The final sentence read, "This matter is now considered closed." He placed the letter in a file folder, along with a copy of his original complaint. He labeled the folder NPD Complaint. He could have hired a lawyer. He could have filed a civil rights lawsuit. He had the resources. But he knew that route would be a long, expensive, and likely fruitless battle against a municipality that would use taxpayer money to defend its officers to the bitter end. A lawsuit would be framed as an attack on the police, and in a small, conservative town like Northwood, that was a battle he was unlikely to win in the court of public opinion. He felt a deep, simmering anger, but he refused to let it curdle into bitterness. Bitterness was a poison, and he had seen what it did to good men. It ate them from the inside out. He had survived combat, had built a life and a business through sheer force of will. He would not let the ignorance of 2 police officers and the corruption of their department diminish him. But he wouldn't forget. He put the file away in his desk drawer, a tangible reminder of the day he learned the true nature of the town he called home. The officers, Miller and Davies, had been emboldened. Their actions, now officially sanctioned by their department, carried no consequences. They had been investigated and cleared, a badge of honor in a culture that viewed citizen complaints as a nuisance. They knew they could get away with it, and that meant they would do it again. The system hadn't just failed to punish them, it had rewarded them, reinforcing the belief that they were above the law they were sworn to enforce. Mark knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this was not over. The closed file was just a placeholder. The real conclusion had yet to be written. Instead of turning his anger outward in a legal battle, he was unlikely to win. Mark Carter channeled it inward, then repurposed it. He made a conscious decision not to let the incident with the Northwood Police Department define him or his relationship with his community. To retreat into bitterness would be a victory for men like Miller and Graves. So, he did the opposite. He dug in. He decided that if the town's institutions were flawed, he would work to build stronger ones from the outside. His logistics company was already a success, but he began to view it as more than just a business. It became a vehicle for change. He launched a paid internship program specifically for graduates of Northwoods Community College, offering them real-world experience and a pathway to a career. He sponsored a local youth basketball league, buying new uniforms and equipment for kids from low-income families. He wasn't just writing checks, he was present. He attended games, mentored the young players, and spoke to them about discipline, teamwork, and integrity, the very principles he'd learned in the military and applied in his own life. He joined the Northwood Chamber of Commerce, not to network for his own business, but to advocate for small, minority-owned businesses that were often overlooked. His voice at the meetings was different. He didn't engage in the usual small-town gossip or petty politics. He came prepared with data, with well-reasoned arguments for economic development that benefited everyone, not just the established players. At first, he was viewed as an outsider, but his consistency and undeniable competence slowly earned him respect. He didn't demand it. He commanded it through his actions. 2 years after his traffic stop, Mark founded the Northwood Community Alliance, a non-profit organization dedicated to fostering better relationships between citizens and local government. Their first initiative was a Know Your Rights seminar, held at the public library. He brought in a civil rights attorney from a neighboring city to explain the law in clear, simple terms. It wasn't an anti-police event, it was a pro-citizen event. He invited the police department to send a representative to participate. They declined. The alliance grew. They organized town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns directly to city council members. They launched a mentorship program pairing successful professionals with high school students. Mark was the heart of it all, but he was careful to build an organization that wasn't dependent on him. He empowered others, delegating responsibility and fostering a new generation of community leaders. Through all this, he never spoke publicly about his own experience with the NPD. It wasn't a secret, but he didn't use it as a political tool. His integrity was his platform. People in Northwood came to know him not as a man with a grievance, but as a man who got things done. They knew him as the founder of the Youth League, the advocate for small businesses, the calm, measured voice at contentious city council meetings. He was building a different kind of power, not the power that came from a badge and a gun, but the power that came from earning the community's trust. He still saw Officer Miller on occasion. Miller would be parked in his patrol car, watching him as he coached a basketball game, or driving past the community center during an alliance meeting. Their eyes would meet for a moment, in Miller's. Mark saw the same resentful arrogance. In his own, he hoped Miller saw nothing but calm resolve. Mark never acknowledged him with more than a polite nod. He refused to give the officer the satisfaction of a confrontation. His work in the community was his response. It was a long game, and Mark was a patient man. He didn't know it at the time, but every action he took was laying a foundation. Every intern he hired, every kid he mentored, every small business he supported was a stone in that foundation. The town was changing, slowly, subtly, and while the police department remained an insular, unaccountable entity, the ground was shifting beneath it. The community was becoming more engaged, more aware, and less willing to accept the status quo. The leadership Mark was providing was creating an alternative to the old, broken systems. A deep reservoir of public trust was being filled, and it was all flowing toward one man, a man the city would soon need more than it could possibly imagine. While Mark Carter was building his reputation, the Northwood Police Department was rotting from the inside out. The decay started at the top, with Chief Frank Thompson, a man who had held the position for 15 years. Thompson was a product of the old guard, a man who viewed the police department as his personal fiefdom and public accountability as a public nuisance. His leadership style was one of benign neglect. As long as his officers kept quiet and his budget was approved by the city council without too much scrutiny. The first crack in the facade appeared not with a bang, but with the quiet click of an accountant's calculator. The city of Northwood, facing a budget shortfall, had hired an outside auditing firm to review the finances of all its municipal departments. It was supposed to be a routine procedure, a box-ticking exercise to find minor efficiencies. No one expected them to find a hornet's nest inside the police department's books. The auditor assigned to the NPD was a meticulous, humorless woman named Eleanor Vance. She wasn't interested in personalities or politics. She was interested in numbers, and the numbers didn't add up. She started with the department's asset forfeiture fund, a slush fund filled with cash and property seized during drug busts and other criminal investigations. The records were a mess, vague, incomplete, and filled with handwritten entries that were nearly illegible. Eleanor started digging. She found receipts for confidential informant payments made out in round numbers with no corresponding case files. She found invoices for specialized surveillance equipment from a company that, upon investigation, was traced to a P.O. box registered to Chief Thompson's brother-in-law. The equipment was never delivered to the department's inventory. She expanded her audit to the overtime budget. She discovered that a small, select group of officers, including Lieutenant Graves from Internal Affairs, were consistently logging massive amounts of overtime for vague assignments like administrative review or ongoing investigations. The overtime slips were all personally signed off by Chief Thompson. The pattern was too clean, too consistent. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was a coordinated scheme. Eleanor followed the money trail. She cross-referenced bank deposits with overtime payouts and asset forfeiture disbursements. She found a network of shell corporations, real estate purchases, and vehicle acquisitions all linked back to Chief Thompson, Lieutenant Graves, and a handful of other senior officers. They had been systematically siphoning money from the department for years, using the asset forfeiture fund as their personal piggy bank and the overtime budget to launder the payments. She worked quietly for 2 months, compiling a mountain of evidence. She made copies of every suspicious invoice, every forged signature, every questionable bank statement. Her final report was over 200 pages long, a dry, factual, and utterly damning indictment of a corrupt administration. When she presented her findings to the city manager and the city council in a closed-door session, the room was plunged into a stunned silence. They were small-town politicians, used to dealing with zoning disputes and complaints about garbage collection. They were not prepared for evidence of felony-level corruption in their own police department. The city manager, a man named George Maxwell, turned pale as he read the executive summary. "This can't be right," one councilwoman murmured, but the look on Eleanor's face told them it was. "Every transaction in this report is documented," Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "The evidence is conclusive. You don't just have a management problem. Mr. Maxwell, you have a criminal conspiracy operating out of your police department, and my professional recommendation is that you turn this entire file over to the State Attorney General's office immediately." The decision was not difficult. The council was terrified. They were not equipped to handle an investigation of this magnitude, and the political fallout if they tried to cover it up would be catastrophic. The call was made. The report was confidentially transmitted to the state capitol. The first domino had fallen. It had nothing to do with Mark Carter's traffic stop or the dozens of other complaints that had been buried by Lieutenant Graves. It was about simple, ugly greed. But that single act of corruption, exposed by a diligent accountant, was about to unravel the entire rotten tapestry of the Northwood Police Department. The blue wall was about to come crashing down, not because of an attack from the outside, but because the foundation itself was corrupt. The State Attorney General's office moved with a speed and efficiency that was terrifying to the insulated leadership of the Northwood Police Department. They didn't announce their investigation. They simply acted. One Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Eleanor Vance's report was delivered, a team of state investigators, accompanied by FBI agents, walked into the Northwood Municipal Building. They weren't there to ask questions. They were there to serve warrants. One team went to the city manager's office to secure the original audit report and all related financial documents. Another team, led by a stern-faced senior agent, walked directly into the police department. The desk sergeant, the same one who had dismissed Mark Carter years earlier, looked up from his crossword puzzle, his mouth falling open as a half-dozen agents in dark suits swept past him without a word. They went straight to the records room, seizing computers, file cabinets, and boxes of documents related to the asset forfeiture and overtime accounts. A second group went to Chief Thompson's office. He was on the phone, laughing with someone, when they entered. The laughter died in his throat. He was presented with a search warrant for his office, his home, and his personal financial records. His face, usually ruddy and confident, turned the color of ash. Simultaneously, another team of agents arrived at the home of Lieutenant Graves. They caught him as he was leaving for work. He saw the official vehicles pull up and, for a moment, his police training took over. He reached for his weapon before realizing they weren't there to serve a warrant on a suspect. They were there for him. His career of burying the truth for others had done nothing to prepare him for the moment his own truths were unearthed. The raid was a surgical strike. By noon, the heart of the NPD's corrupt leadership had been cut out. Chief Thompson and Lieutenant Graves were not arrested that day, but they were placed on administrative leave and informed they were the primary subjects of a major corruption investigation. Their badges and service weapons were confiscated. They were escorted from the building they had run for over a decade, stripped of their authority in full view of their subordinates. The news spread through the town like a wildfire. It was the only thing anyone talked about. The local newspaper, which had for years published nothing but puff pieces about the police department, was suddenly scrambling to cover the biggest scandal in the town's history. Rumors flew, but the reality confirmed by the city manager's terse press conference was damning enough. The chief and other senior officers were under investigation by the state and the FBI for financial malfeasance. For the rank-and-file officers of the NPD, it was a seismic shock. The men who had been untouchable, who had set the tone for the entire department, were suddenly powerless. The culture of impunity they had fostered was shattered overnight. Officers like Miller and Davies, who had operated with the confidence that their superiors would always have their back, were now adrift. The wall that had protected them had crumbled from the top down. A week later, facing irrefutable evidence and the threat of a lengthy prison sentence, Chief Frank Thompson resigned in disgrace. He submitted a one-sentence letter to the city manager, effective immediately. Lieutenant Graves followed suit 2 days later, hoping that his resignation might curry some favor with the prosecutors. The department was now leaderless, its command structure decapitated. The city council appointed a captain as acting chief, but he was a holdover from the old regime, and no one, including himself, believed he had the credibility or the mandate to lead. The Northwood Police Department was in a state of freefall. Morale plummeted. The public's trust, already frayed in many communities, was utterly destroyed. The department was a national embarrassment, a case study in small-town corruption. The city council was in full-blown panic mode. They had to hire a new chief, and they knew it couldn't be anyone from inside the department. They needed an outsider. They needed someone with unimpeachable integrity, someone who already had the community's respect. They needed someone who could come in and clean house, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the broken culture of the past. As they sat in an emergency session, brainstorming a list of candidates, one name kept coming up. It was a name that made some of them uncomfortable, a name that was inextricably linked to the department's past sins. But it was also the only name that made any sense. It was Mark Carter. The emergency session of the Northwood City Council was held in an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. The 5 council members and city manager George Maxwell sat around a polished table, the weight of the town's crisis pressing down on them. They had spent the first hour debating the merits of hiring a national search firm to find a new police chief, a process that would take months and cost a fortune. "We don't have months," Councilwoman Davis argued, her voice strained. "We have a department in shambles and a community that thinks we're all either corrupt or incompetent. We need to act decisively, and we need to do it now." "But who?" the council president asked, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "Every captain in that department is tainted by association with Thompson. We need to bring in someone from the outside, someone clean. An outsider won't know this town," another councilman countered. "They won't know the people or the politics. They'll be eaten alive by the police union before they even get started." It was George Maxwell, the city manager, who finally said the name aloud. He had been quiet until now, listening to the circular arguments. "There is one person," he began, his voice hesitant. "He's an outsider in the sense that he's never been part of the NPD, but he's very much a part of this community. He has a background in military law enforcement. He's a respected business owner, and no one in this town questions his integrity. He paused, letting the silence hang in the room. Mark Carter. The name landed on the table with a thud. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a flurry of objections. Mark Carter? The man who filed that complaint a few years back? The one who runs that community group that's always criticizing the department? Are you insane, George? The rank and file would revolt. They'd see it as a slap in the face. And maybe that's exactly what they need, Councilwoman Davis shot back, her eyes flashing. The department's reputation is in the gutter because of the culture that Frank Thompson created, the culture that protected the officers who harassed Mr. Carter in the first place. Appointing him wouldn't be a slap in the face. It would be a clear signal that the old way of doing business is over. It would be a radical move. Yes, but we are in a situation that calls for radical solutions. Her logic was undeniable. The usual political calculations no longer applied. They couldn't just hire a safe, predictable candidate. They needed to restore public trust, and that required a gesture of profound change. Hiring Mark Carter would be that gesture. It would be an apology, a course correction, and a statement of intent all rolled into one. He was, in a strange way, the perfect candidate precisely because of his history with the department. He knew its flaws from the receiving end. The debate raged for another hour, but the momentum had shifted. The risks of hiring him were great, but the risks of not making a bold move were greater. The town was demanding accountability, and Mark Carter was the living embodiment of it. Finally, the council president called for a vote. It was 3-2 in favor of offering him the position. The next afternoon, George Maxwell drove to Mark's office. He found him in a meeting with one of his junior logistics coordinators, mapping out a shipping route on a large screen. Mark concluded his meeting and led the city manager into his private office, a modest space with a large window overlooking the town. "George," Mark said, gesturing to a chair, "to what do I owe the pleasure? This is a bit outside your usual territory." Maxwell, a man normally composed and professional, seemed nervous. He sat down and got straight to the point. "Mark, the city is in a crisis. You know what's happened at the police department. It's a mess. The public trust is gone. We, the council and I, we need to make a change. A real change." Mark listened, his expression unreadable. He had been following the news. Of course, he knew the details of the corruption scandal. "We need a new chief of police," Maxwell continued, his voice dropping. "We need someone who can rebuild the department from the ground up, someone with integrity, with leadership experience, and with the respect of the community. We need you. Mark, the city council has authorized me to offer you the position." Mark didn't react. He didn't show surprise or satisfaction. He just sat behind his desk, his hands folded, and looked at the city manager. The silence stretched out, becoming uncomfortable for Maxwell. Mark was processing the sheer, stunning irony of the situation. The same city that had sanctioned the police department that had humiliated him, that had ignored his legitimate complaint, was now coming to him, hat in hand, asking him to save it. "You're asking the man your department profiled and harassed to become its leader," Mark said, his voice a flat statement of fact. Maxwell flinched. "Yes," he said quietly. We know what happened to you was wrong, and maybe that's why you're the only person who can fix it." It was a desperate, Hail Mary pass, and they both knew it. But it was also the truth. Mark had spent the last few years building the community up. Now he was being asked to tear down and rebuild the very institution that stood in opposition to that work. It was a monumental task, and a dangerous one. He would face resentment, insubordination, and outright hatred from within the department. But it was also a chance to effect real, lasting change. It was a chance to ensure that what happened to him would never happen to anyone else in Northwood again. He looked past Maxwell, out the window at the town below, his town. He had a decision to make. Mark asked for 24 hours to consider the offer. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. He genuinely needed the time. That evening, he sat on the back porch of his house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He thought about his time in the army, the weight of command, the responsibility for the lives of his soldiers. He thought about the logistics company he had built, the satisfaction of creating something from nothing. And he thought about that afternoon on Oak Street, the heat of the pavement, the condescending smirk on Officer Miller's face, the feeling of utter powerlessness. The offer from the city council wasn't just a job, it was a chance to reclaim that power, not for himself, but for the community. It was a chance to answer the injustice not with revenge, but with reform. By the time the sun had disappeared completely, he had made his decision. He called George Maxwell the next morning. "I accept," he said, his voice calm and steady, "on 2 conditions. First, I have complete autonomy over personnel decisions, hiring, firing, and promotions. No interference from the council. Second, I want a full independent audit of all pending and closed internal affairs complaints from the last 5 years. Maxwell agreed without hesitation. He was so relieved he didn't care about the conditions. He just needed a chief. "Welcome aboard, Chief Carter," he said. The announcement was made at a press conference that afternoon. The small room at City Hall was packed with local reporters and a few from regional news outlets who had been covering the corruption scandal. When Mark Carter was introduced as the new chief of police, a wave of stunned murmurs rippled through the room. It was a shocking, audacious choice, and everyone knew it. The news hit the Northwood Police Department like a concussion grenade. Officers gathered in the break room, watching the press conference on a small television, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fury. "They can't be serious," one officer said. "It's a joke, right? They hired the guy who sued the department?" He hadn't sued, but the myth served their narrative of victimhood. "This is the council spitting in our faces. They're handing the keys to the enemy." Officer Miller stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold rage. He watched Mark on the screen, standing tall in his civilian suit, answering reporters' questions with a calm confidence that Miller found infuriating. This was the man he had pulled over, the man he had tried to intimidate, the man whose complaint he had laughed off. And now, that same man was going to be his boss. It was an inversion of the natural order of things, a world turned upside down. His partner, Davies, was more pragmatic. "What are we gonna do?" he asked quietly, standing beside Miller. "He's going to come for us. You know, that complaint file is going to be the first thing he looks for." "Let him," Miller sneered, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "It was a good stop. We were cleared. Graves handled it. There's nothing he can do." But even as he said the words, he felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Graves was gone. Thompson was gone. The men who had protected him, who had guaranteed his impunity, were disgraced and powerless. He was exposed in a way he had never been before. The appointment of Mark Carter as chief of police created a seismic shockwave that fractured the department. A few younger officers, who had long been disgusted by the cronyism of the old administration, saw it as a sign of hope, a chance for real change. But for the old guard, the officers who had benefited from Thompson's lax oversight and who shared Miller's worldview, it was a declaration of war. They saw Mark not as a leader, but as an occupying force. They saw his appointment not as an effort to reform the department, but to destroy it. And they began to whisper, in hallways and in parking lots, about how they would make his tenure impossible. They would not make it easy for him. They would resist. They would show him what happened when an outsider tried to tell them how to do their jobs. The battle for the soul of the Northwood Police Department had just begun. Chief Carter's first official day was a Monday. He arrived at the station at 700 hours, dressed not in a suit, but in a simple, crisp uniform he'd had custom tailored. It was a standard chief's uniform, dark navy blue, with 4 stars on the collar and a new patch on the sleeve, one he had designed himself over the weekend, a slight modification of the old city seal that emphasized the word service. He wore no decorations, no military ribbons. The uniform was a message. He was not a civilian administrator. He was one of them now, a law enforcement officer, and he would be held to the same standard. He spent the first hour meeting with the department's civilian staff and the command staff who hadn't been swept up in the scandal. His demeanor was professional, direct, and respectful. He didn't talk about the past. He talked about the future. He laid out his initial priorities: restoring operational stability, re-engaging with the community, and conducting a top-to-bottom review of all departmental policies. At 0800, he had scheduled his first all-hands assembly. Roll call for the day shift. Every available officer was ordered to attend. They filed into the station's largest briefing room, a drab, windowless space with fluorescent lighting that cast a pallid glow on their faces. The mood was tense, resentful. They sat with their arms crossed, their expressions ranging from sullen to openly hostile. They were a captive audience, forced to listen to the man they considered an interloper. Officers Miller and Davies sat in the back row. Miller leaned back in his chair, affecting an air of bored indifference, but his eyes were locked on the door. He was waiting. Chief Carter entered the room at precisely 0800. He walked to the podium at the front, carrying a single file folder. The room, which had been filled with low murmurs, fell completely, unnervingly silent. He opened the folder, but he didn't look down at it. Instead, he scanned the room, making eye contact with as many officers as he could. His gaze was steady, unflinching. It was the look of a commander assessing his troops. When his eyes found Miller and Davies in the back row, he held their gaze for just a moment longer. He saw Miller's jaw tighten. He saw Davies look away, unable to meet his eyes. There was no flicker of recognition in the chief's expression, no hint of personal animosity. There was only the calm, appraising look of a leader taking measure of his subordinates. That neutrality was more unnerving to Miller than any open display of anger would have been. "Good morning," Chief Carter began, his voice filling the silent room. It was the same calm, deep voice Miller remembered from the traffic stop. "My name is Mark Carter, and I am your new chief of police. I know that my appointment has been the subject of much discussion. I know that some of you are apprehensive, and some of you are angry. That's understandable. You have been through a tumultuous few weeks, and your trust in leadership has been broken." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I am not here to relitigate the past. The actions of the former chief and his associates are now in the hands of the justice system. Our job is to look forward. Our job is to rebuild this department into something the citizens of Northwood can be proud of, and something you can be proud of, because right now, neither is the case." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This will not be an easy process," he continued. "There are going to be changes. We are going to review every policy, every procedure, from use of force to community engagement. We are going to demand a level of accountability and transparency that this department has not seen before. We are going to become a department that serves the community, not one that rules over it. Our guiding principle will be integrity. If you have it, you will have a place here. If you do not, You will not. It was a clear, unambiguous line in the sand. I know what many of you are thinking, he said, his voice dropping slightly. You're thinking that I'm an outsider, that I don't understand what it's like to wear this uniform, to do this job. You're right. I haven't walked in your shoes. But I have worn a uniform in service of my country for 20 years. I have led men in combat. I understand chain of command. I understand discipline. And I understand the sacred trust that is placed in those who are given a badge and a weapon, a trust that has been shattered here, and that we will work to restore. He closed the folder. My door is always open. If you have concerns, you bring them to me. If you have ideas, you bring them to me. If you are committed to doing this job with honor and integrity, you have my full support. That is all. Dismissed. He turned and walked out of the room. The officers remained seated for a moment, in stunned silence. The speech had not been what they expected. It wasn't a vindictive tirade or a liberal lecture on policing. It was a clear, concise, and utterly resolute statement of command. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't threatened. He had simply laid out the new reality. As the officers began to file out, Davies turned to Miller. Well, he said, what do you think? Miller stared at the empty podium. The man he had dismissed as just another target for harassment was now in total control. I think, Miller said, his voice low and venomous, that he's not going to be here for long. We'll see how long his integrity lasts when he realizes he can't do this job without us. It was a threat. The resistance had its first unofficial marching order. Chief Carter knew that his first speech was just words. The real test would be in his actions. And in the response of the officers he now commanded, he began his tenure not by sitting in his office, but by walking the halls, observing operations, and re-implementing a policy that Chief Thompson had abandoned years ago. He went on patrol. He had his own patrol car outfitted and spent several hours each day driving through the city, responding to calls alongside his officers. He wanted to see the department's operations firsthand, and he wanted his officers to see that he wasn't afraid to do the work. This move was met with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Some of the younger officers found it refreshing, a sign of engaged leadership. But for the old guard, it was an intrusion. They saw him as a spy in their midst, monitoring their every move. Officer Miller became the unofficial leader of this resentful faction. He was too smart to engage in open insubordination, which would be easy to discipline. Instead, he began a campaign of passive resistance, a series of small, deniable acts designed to test the boundaries of the new chief's authority. It started with paperwork. Reports from Miller's shift would come in late, incomplete, or filled with vague language. When a supervisor would question him, Miller would feign confusion. Sorry, Lieutenant, just trying to get used to the new chief's emphasis on community engagement time. Had to cut the report short to go chat with some local business owners. It was a sarcastic jab at one of Carter's new initiatives. Framed as compliance, next, it was his presence on the street. Chief Carter had mandated that officers were to spend more time out of their cars, walking beats in commercial districts and residential neighborhoods to build relationships. Miller would follow the order to the letter, but with a malicious compliance. He'd park his car, get out, and stand in one spot for an hour, arms crossed, sunglasses on, projecting an intimidating presence that did the opposite of building community trust. When asked, he'd say he was maintaining a high-visibility deterrent presence per department policy. His resistance began to embolden others. A small group of officers loyal to the old regime started to mimic his behavior. They would respond to non-emergency calls slowly. They would forget to turn on their body cameras. Citing technical malfunctions, they would take long breaks at a diner known to be a cop hangout. their patrol cars conspicuously absent from their assigned sectors. It was a subtle, coordinated effort to undermine Carter's authority and sabotage his reforms, all while maintaining plausible deniability. Chief Carter was not blind to what was happening. He'd led enough men to recognize the signs of a brewing insurgency. He saw the late reports, noticed the patterns of behavior, and heard the whispers that stopped whenever he entered a room. He knew Miller was at the center of it, but he also knew he couldn't act without clear, irrefutable evidence of misconduct. A direct confrontation with Miller without cause would make him a martyr to the old guard and escalate the conflict. He chose a different strategy. He began documenting everything. Every late report from Miller was logged. Every technical malfunction with his body camera was noted. He started reviewing the GPS data from the patrol cars, cross-referencing their locations with their activity logs. A pattern of non-performance began to emerge, a clear dereliction of duty that went beyond simple laziness. The final straw came during a community meeting that Chief Carter had organized in a historically black neighborhood. It was a key part of his outreach strategy, an attempt to build bridges with a community that had long been over-policed and underprotected. He had asked for 2 officers to be present, to listen to the residents' concerns and participate in the dialogue. The assignment had fallen to Miller and Davies. Davies showed up. Miller did not. An hour into the meeting, Carter received a call on his radio, a report of a suspicious person loitering near the high school. It was a low-priority call, the kind that could have been handled by any officer. The dispatcher announced that Officer Miller was responding. Carter knew the high school was on the opposite side of town from the community meeting. Miller had manufactured a reason to blow off the assignment. He had chosen to prioritize a nuisance call over a direct order to engage with the very community his new chief was trying to reach. It was a deliberate, public act of defiance. He was testing Carter, daring him to react. Chief Carter finished the community meeting, answering questions and taking notes. He showed no sign of anger or frustration. But as he drove back to the station that night, he knew the time for observation was over. Miller had made a critical mistake. He had mistaken the chief's patience for weakness. He had given Carter exactly what he needed, a clear, documented case of insubordination. And Carter now knew that the only way to break the resistance was to cut off its head. He had to go after Miller, and he knew exactly where to start. The old, buried complaint file. The next morning, Chief Carter walked down to the records department, a cramped, dusty room in the basement of the station. He greeted the clerk and made his request. "I need you to pull a closed internal affairs file for me. Complainant's name is Carter, Mark. It would have been from about 5 years ago." The clerk, a woman who had been working in that room for 30 years, looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and understanding. She knew exactly which file he was talking about. Everyone in the department knew the story. She nodded silently, turned to a row of tall gray filing cabinets, and pulled open a drawer labeled C. After a moment, she retrieved a thin manila folder and handed it to him. Chief Carter took the file and returned to his office, closing the door behind him. He sat down at his desk and looked at the folder. On the tab, someone had written in black ink, "File number 34-B, Carter, M. Complaint, unfounded." He opened it. The contents were even sparser than he remembered. His own detailed 4-page complaint was on top. Beneath it was a single-page summary report from Officer Miller, a boilerplate recitation of the flickering tail light and brief professional interaction. Then came the final document, Lieutenant Graves's 1-page closing report, declaring the complaint unfounded and exonerating Miller and Davies. That was it. There were no interview transcripts, no notes from Graves, no evidence that any real investigation had ever taken place. It was the work of a cover-up, designed not to find the truth, but to bury it as quickly and quietly as possible. Carter read through the documents again, but this time he was reading them not as a victim, but as the chief of police. He had access to systems and information he didn't have before. He turned to his computer and pulled up the department's evidence logs from the date of the incident. In his complaint, he had noted that both officers were wearing body cameras. In their reports, neither Miller nor Davies had mentioned body camera footage. Graves's report made no mention of it either. He searched the evidence database for any videos logged by Miller or Davies on that date. Nothing. According to the official record, the cameras had either not been running or the footage had not been submitted into evidence. Carter knew that was a violation of department policy at the time. All citizen interactions resulting from a traffic stop were supposed to be recorded. This was the leverage he needed. The missing footage was a more serious and more easily provable offense than the harassment itself. He called in the new head of internal affairs, a lieutenant he had just promoted, a woman named Sarah Jenkins. She was sharp, by the book, and had no loyalty to the old guard. "Lieutenant," he said, pushing the file across his desk, "I'm formally reopening this investigation. I want you to focus on one thing: the missing body camera footage. Department policy at the time mandated its use and submission. I want to know why it wasn't logged into evidence. Interview the records clerk. Interview the IT manager who was responsible for the camera systems back then. And then, I want you to schedule a formal, on-the-record interview with Officer Davies." He was starting with Davies for a reason. Davies had been the passive partner. He had a family, a pension to protect. He was the weak link. Carter suspected that faced with a formal investigation and the potential loss of his job over a cover-up, his loyalty to Miller would evaporate. "What about Officer Miller?" Jenkins asked. "We'll get to him," Carter said. "Let's see what Davies has to say first." Jenkins took the file and left. The gears of a real investigation had finally begun to turn. Carter knew he was treading on dangerous ground. Reopening a closed complaint against a current officer, especially one that he himself had filed, was a fraught move. The police union would scream foul. Miller's allies would accuse him of a personal vendetta. But Carter was meticulous. He was not investigating the harassment, he was investigating the cover-up. He was focusing on the clear, objective violations of departmental policy, failure to submit evidence and falsifying an official report. He had laid a trap. Miller's arrogance had led him to believe the past was buried, but he and Graves had been sloppy. They had closed the file, but they had left a loose thread, the ghost of a digital recording. And now, Chief Carter was pulling on that thread, ready to unravel the whole lie. He didn't know what he would find, but he was certain of one thing. The truth of what happened on that sunny afternoon 5 years ago was not going to stay buried forever. Lieutenant Jenkins began her investigation with the quiet efficiency that had earned her the promotion. She first interviewed the records clerk, who nervously admitted that Lieutenant Graves had personally handled all evidence submissions related to complaint number 34-B. It was highly unusual. Standard procedure was for the evidence to be logged by the clerk, not a supervising lieutenant. Next, Jenkins spoke to the retired IT manager. After she assured him that he was protected under whistleblower statutes, he told her a story he had been waiting years to tell. He said that Graves had come to him a day after the complaint was filed and asked for the server archives of Miller's and Davies's body cameras from the previous afternoon. The IT manager had located the files and, following protocol, had made a backup copy onto a separate, secure server before transferring the primary files to Graves. He never saw the primary files again. They were never logged into evidence. But the backup server? It was an old system, rarely accessed, and he was sure the data was still there. He gave Jenkins the access protocols. Jenkins, her heart pounding with anticipation, went to the server room, Following the old manager's instructions, she navigated the arcane command line interface of the backup system. And there it was. 2 video files, time-stamped and labeled with Miller's and Davies's badge numbers. She downloaded them onto a secure hard drive and went back to her office to watch. The footage was crystal clear. The audio was perfect. It was exactly as Mark Carter had described. But seeing it was a different experience. The video from Davies's camera showed the entire stop from his perspective near the rear of the car. It captured Miller's aggressive approach, his immediate demand for documents without stating a cause for the stop. It captured Mark's calm, polite questions. But it was Miller's camera that was the smoking gun. The forward-facing camera showed his view of Mark through the driver's window. The audio captured every word, every nuance. "This is a nice car," Miller's voice said, dripping with condescension. "We've had a report of a vehicle matching this description involved in a theft." He lied. The fabrication now preserved in digital clarity. The footage then showed Mark's formal protest as he was ordered out of the car. It showed Miller's illegal search, his hands clearly visible rummaging through the center console and glove compartment after Mark had explicitly denied consent. The camera captured his growing frustration as he found nothing, and then came the final, damning piece of evidence. As Miller slammed the car door, he muttered to himself, just loud enough for the microphone to pick it up. "Arrogant bastard thinks he can get away with it." He then walked back to Mark and delivered his line about the flickering taillight. As he and Davies walked back to their patrol car, Davies could be heard asking, "Was his light really out?" Miller laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Hell no," he said. "Just had to give him something. Put him in his place." The video ended. Lieutenant Jenkins sat back in her chair, stunned. It was all there. The illegal stop based on a lie. The illegal search. The falsified reason for the stop. The explicit admission of racial and class-based animus. The footage didn't just corroborate Mark's complaint. It proved that Miller's and Graves's official reports were complete fabrications. This wasn't just a policy violation. It was criminal. They had falsified official documents and conspired to conceal evidence. Jenkins made 2 copies of the video file. One she placed in a secure evidence locker. The other she brought directly to Chief Carter. She walked into his office, closed the door, and placed the small hard drive on his desk. "You were right, Chief," she said, her voice tight. "They didn't just bury the investigation, they buried the evidence, and it's worse than you thought." Chief Carter didn't ask any questions. He simply plugged the drive into his computer and, with Jenkins standing beside him, watched the 9-minute video. He watched the encounter that had been seared into his memory play out on the screen. He saw the anger and arrogance in Miller's posture. He heard the calm resolve in his own voice. He heard Miller's admission to Davies. He watched it all without a word, his face a stoic mask. When the video finished, he closed the laptop. He looked at Jenkins. His eyes were cold, hard steel. "Schedule the interview with Officer Davies for tomorrow morning," he said. "Show him the video, then schedule Officer Miller for the afternoon. There will be no more whispers of rebellion. There will be no more resistance. There will only be accountability." The time for patience was over. The unmistakable truth of the body camera had given him the weapon he needed, and he was about to use it to finally cleanse his department. Officer Davies arrived for his internal affairs interview looking pale and nervous. He had been a police officer for 20 years, but he had never been on this side of the table. He sat down opposite Lieutenant Jenkins. A union representative sat beside him, looking bored. Assuming this was a minor procedural issue. "Officer Davies," Jenkins began, her voice formal. "We are here today as part of the reopened investigation into complaint file number 34B. I'd like you to recount the events of the traffic stop involving Mr. Mark Carter 5 years ago." Davies, coached by the union rep, recited the official story, the one from Miller's report. We observed a vehicle with a malfunctioning taillight. We initiated a traffic stop. The driver was somewhat uncooperative, but we issued a verbal warning and released him. Jenkins listened patiently until he was finished. She made a few notes. Thank you, officer. Now, I'd like to show you something. She turned a large monitor on the table toward him and pressed play. The video from his own body camera started. Davies's face went white. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. The union rep, no longer bored, sat bolt upright in his chair. They watched the entire incident unfold. Then Jenkins played the footage from Miller's camera. They heard Miller's lies, saw his illegal search, and most damningly, they heard his admission in the car. Hell no, just had to give him something, put him in his place. Jenkins stopped the video. The room was silent. The union rep slowly sank back into his chair and put his face in his hands. He knew there was no defending this. Officer Davies, Jenkins said, her voice quiet but sharp as a razor. That was you. That was your partner. That was your stop. The official report, which you co-signed, is a complete fabrication. The evidence was deliberately concealed. This is no longer about a 5-year-old traffic stop. This is about conspiracy, falsifying official documents, and obstruction of justice. Your pension is on the line. Your career is on the line, and potential criminal charges are on the line. She paused, letting the weight of his situation crush him. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time. Tell me what happened. The truth. Davies looked at his union rep, who offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The game was over. Davies broke. He spent the next hour telling Jenkins everything. He admitted the stop was pretextual, driven by Miller's belief that a black man in a BMW must be a criminal. He admitted they both knew the taillight story was a lie. He admitted that Miller had searched the car without consent. And he admitted that Lieutenant Graves had coached them on what to write in their report and had personally taken the body camera footage. Telling them he would take care of it, it was a full confession. Jenkins had everything she needed. That afternoon, it was Miller's turn. He walked into the interview room with the same arrogant swagger he always had. He sat down, smirked at Jenkins, and said, "Let's get this over with. I've got better things to do than rehash some old, bogus complaint from a guy with a chip on his shoulder." Jenkins didn't respond to the taunt. She simply said, "Officer Miller, I'm going to show you a video." She played the footage from his own body camera. As the scene played out, Miller's smirk slowly vanished. His face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he watched his own illegal actions. When the video reached the part where he admitted the lie to Davies, a flicker of panic finally appeared in his eyes. Jenkins stopped the video. "Comments? Officer?" Miller's training kicked in. He tried to bluff his way out. "That footage is taken out of context. It doesn't show everything. My actions were based on my training and experience." "Then let's talk about your official report," Jenkins said, pushing a copy across the table. "It states you conducted a cursory visual inspection. The video shows you entering the vehicle and searching the console and glove compartment. Which is it?" "My memory of the specific details is 5 years old." Miller deflected. "The report reflects my best recollection at the time." "Your report makes no mention of body camera footage being recorded. Why was this evidence? A clear violation of department policy? Not submitted?" "Must have been a technical glitch. The upload probably failed." He lied. Jenkins leaned forward. "Officer Miller, we have a sworn statement from your partner, Officer Davies. Given just this morning, he has confirmed that the stop was pretextual, that the search was illegal, and that you and he conspired with Lieutenant Graves to file a false report and conceal the video evidence." The color drained from Miller's face. He had been so sure that the blue wall would hold, that his partner would never betray him. The arrogance that had been his armor for his entire career crumbled, leaving behind a man who was finally, inescapably trapped by the truth. He looked at Jenkins, then at his union rep, who just shook his head slowly. There was nothing left to say. The interview was over. The glare of the interrogation room had burned away the last of his lies. The conclusion of the internal affairs investigation was swift and decisive. With the undeniable video evidence and a full confession from Officer Davies, Lieutenant Jenkins's final report was a damning, meticulously documented account of misconduct and corruption. It laid out, in excruciating detail, the initial illegal stop, the falsified reports, and the conspiracy to conceal evidence. Her recommendation was unequivocal: termination for Officer Miller, and a lengthy suspension and demotion for Officer Davies, pending his continued cooperation with the state's ongoing investigation into the former administration. Chief Carter reviewed the report. He read every word, every finding of fact. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about applying the standard he had promised in his first meeting: integrity. Miller had shown a complete lack of it, not just during the stop 5 years ago, but in his insubordination and attempts to sabotage the department's reforms. He was a cancer on the department, and the only solution was to cut him out. The next day, Officer Miller was ordered to report to the chief's office. He arrived in his uniform, but he looked like a man who hadn't slept. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen, defeated anger. His union representative was with him, but it was a formality. They both knew how this was going to end. Chief Carter was seated behind his desk. Lieutenant Jenkins stood to the side, a silent witness. Carter did not ask Miller to sit. "Officer Miller," Carter began, his voice devoid of emotion, "I have here the final report of Internal Affairs Investigation number YA-2024-001 regarding your conduct in the matter of complaint file number 34-B and the subsequent cover-up. The investigation finds that you violated multiple sections of the Departmental Code of Conduct and the State Penal Code, including illegal search and seizure, falsifying a government record, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Do you have anything to say?" Miller stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. "No, sir," he muttered. "Then it is my duty to inform you that, effective immediately, your employment with the Northwood Police Department is terminated." Carter pushed a single-page letter across the desk. It was Miller's official notice of termination. "You will be escorted to your locker to clean out your personal belongings. You will turn in your badge, your weapon, and all other departmental property. You will then be escorted from the building." Miller finally looked up, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. "You've been waiting for this since the day you got here, haven't you?" he spat. "This was never about reform. It was about revenge." Chief Carter leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "No, Miller. This is not revenge. This is accountability. It's a concept you and the previous administration seem to have forgotten. You took an oath to uphold the law, and you used your badge to break it. You harassed a citizen because you didn't like the color of his skin or the car he drove. Then you lied about it, and you continued to be a divisive and insubordinate presence in this department. You did this to yourself. You are a disgrace to the uniform you're wearing." The words hit Miller like a physical blow. He had no response. The union rep put a hand on his shoulder and guided him out of the office. The unceremonious end of Miller's career sent a shockwave through the department. Far greater than Carter's initial appointment, this was real. The rules had actually changed. An officer who was once considered untouchable, a symbol of the old guard's power, had been fired. And not quietly. The news of his termination and the reasons for it were made public. The message was clear and unmistakable. The old ways of policing in Northwood were over. The blue wall had been breached, and accountability was no longer just a word in a policy manual. Officer Davies accepted his suspension and demotion without protest. He became a cooperating witness for the state investigators, providing them with invaluable information about how Graves and Thompson had run the department, trading favors and burying complaints to maintain loyalty. For the first time in months, a sense of cautious optimism began to spread among the department's better officers. They saw that the new chief was serious, that he was willing to make the hard decisions needed to fix what was broken. The resistance that Miller had tried to build crumbled without its leader. Officers started showing up to community meetings willingly. Reports were filed on time. Body cameras, miraculously, stopped having technical glitches. The culture of the department had not changed overnight, but a fundamental shift had occurred. The fear of accountability had replaced the arrogance of impunity. The long, difficult process of rebuilding could finally begin, with the primary source of internal resistance removed. Chief Mark Carter began the monumental task of rebuilding the Northwood Police Department from its rotten foundation. His approach was methodical, mirroring the way he had built his business. Create a solid plan, implement it with precision, and measure the results. This wasn't just about punishing bad actors. It was about creating a system where bad actors could not thrive. His first major initiative was a complete overhaul of the department's policies and training. He brought in outside experts, academics, civil rights attorneys, and experienced police reformers to review and rewrite every chapter of the NPD policy manual, from use of force continuums to protocols for traffic stops. The new policies emphasized de-escalation, procedural justice, and the sanctity of constitutional rights. Every officer, from rookie to captain, was required to undergo extensive retraining and pass a rigorous exam on the new protocols. Next, he dismantled the toothless Internal Affairs Division that Lieutenant Graves had run. In its place, he established an Office of Professional Responsibility, headed by Lieutenant Jenkins and including 2 civilian members appointed by a newly formed Citizen Oversight Board. For the first time, complaints against officers would be investigated by a body that wasn't composed solely of other police officers. The process became transparent, with findings and disciplinary actions made public. Recognizing that the department's culture was as broken as its policies, Carter focused on recruitment and promotion. He changed the hiring criteria to prioritize candidates with college degrees, experience in social work or mental health, and a demonstrated commitment to community service. He instituted a new promotions process based on merit and performance evaluations that included feedback from the community. Not just seniority and arrest numbers, he wanted to build a department of guardians, not warriors. His most visible reform was his approach to community partnership. The meetings he had started were no longer occasional events. They became a core function of the department. He established precinct-level advisory councils, giving residents a direct line of communication with their local officers. He launched a Coffee with a Cop program, getting officers out of their cars and into casual conversations with the people they served. He put real resources into the Police Athletic League he had once sponsored as a civilian, turning it into a cornerstone of the department's youth outreach. These changes were not universally popular. Some veteran officers grumbled about the social work and the endless meetings. They missed the simplicity of the old us versus them model. But they were now the minority. The new generation of officers being hired, and the good officers who had been waiting for a leader like Carter, embraced the changes. They saw the positive impact on the streets. 911 calls for minor disputes began to decrease as people started talking to their neighborhood beat cops again. Trust, once shattered, was slowly, painstakingly being rebuilt, one positive interaction at a time. Carter also used his position to advocate for resources that went beyond traditional policing. He worked with the city council to secure funding for a mobile crisis unit, pairing mental health professionals with officers to respond to calls involving individuals in psychiatric distress. This freed up officers to handle criminal matters and resulted in better, more humane outcomes for people in need. He ran the department like he ran his company. With a focus on data and accountability, he implemented an early intervention system that flagged officers who were the subject of multiple complaints, used force more frequently than their peers, or engaged in high-risk behaviors like repeated pursuits. The system wasn't designed to be punitive, but to identify officers who needed retraining, counseling, or a different assignment before their behavior escalated. A year into his tenure, the Northwood Police Department was almost unrecognizable. The sullen, resentful force he had inherited was being transformed into a modern, professional, and more compassionate organization. The changes were not just on paper. They were visible in the way officers carried themselves, in the way they spoke to citizens, and in the declining number of citizen complaints and use-of-force incidents. Mark Carter had not just taken over a police department. He had given it a new soul. He was building it from the ashes of the old, not in his own image, but in the image of what he believed law enforcement should be, a service dedicated to protecting all members of the community with integrity, fairness, and respect. It was a long, arduous process, but for the first time in a generation, the Northwood Police Department was on the right path. 2 years after he took the job, Chief Mark Carter stood in his office, looking out the large window at the town below. It was a sunny afternoon, much like the one 5 years ago that had set this whole improbable journey in motion. The town didn't look dramatically different, but Carter knew how much had changed. He saw one of his officers walking down the main street, not with the swagger of an occupying soldier, but with a friendly, open demeanor. He watched as the officer stopped to chat with a local shop owner, sharing a laugh before continuing on his foot patrol. It was a small moment, but it was everything. His desk was no longer cluttered with plans for reform, but with the daily business of running a functional police department. The Citizen Oversight Board was working effectively. The new training protocols were ingrained in the recruits at the academy. The number of formal complaints had dropped by 70%, and for the first time in known history, the racial disparity in traffic stops had been eliminated. The department wasn't perfect, but it was accountable. It was serving its community. He sometimes thought about Miller. After being fired, Miller had moved out of state, a bitter and disgraced man. Davies had served his suspension, accepted his demotion, and was now a quiet, by-the-book patrol officer who seemed grateful to still have a job. The corruption trial of former Chief Thompson and Lieutenant Graves had concluded a few months prior. Both were found guilty. Thompson, due to his age and health, received a sentence of 5 years in a federal prison. Graves, who had been less cooperative, received 8. The chapter was well and truly closed. Mark's journey from a victim of the system to its leader had taught him a profound lesson. He hadn't sought this role. He hadn't wanted the fight. But when it came to him, he had faced it with the same integrity he applied to every other aspect of his life. He had proven that one person, armed with the truth and an unwavering commitment to principle, could in fact change a broken system. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was possible. His legacy wouldn't be written in headlines or history books. It would be written in the quiet, everyday interactions between his officers and the citizens they served. It would be found in the absence of fear during a traffic stop, in the presence of trust where there was once only suspicion. His thoughts drifted back to that initial, humiliating encounter. He now understood the psychology of a man like Miller, not as a simple caricature of a racist cop, but as something more complex and pathetic. Miller's aggression hadn't sprung from a position of strength, but from a deep well of insecurity. He saw a black man like Mark, successful, articulate, driving a car better than his own, and it challenged his entire worldview, a fragile construct where he, by virtue of his badge and his race, was supposed to be on top. His authority wasn't a tool to serve the law. It was a shield to protect his own brittle ego. The stop wasn't about policing. It was about reasserting a social hierarchy that he felt was threatened. He wasn't a predator hunting for criminals. He was a scavenger hunting for validation. And he saw Mark as an easy target. If he could go back and advise his younger self on that day, what would he say? He might have told himself to turn on his phone's voice recorder the moment the lights flashed. Documentation is a shield. He might have suggested positioning his hands on the wheel in a way that his military academy ring was visible, a subtle signal that he was not someone to be trifled with. Perhaps he could have asked for a supervisor to respond to the scene the moment Miller's questions turned from procedural to personal. These small acts might have de-escalated the situation or, failing that, provided even stronger evidence for the complaint that followed. They were strategies of self-preservation in a system not designed to protect him. But ultimately, the responsibility for the conflict did not lie with the victim's strategy, but with the aggressor's choice. The core lesson wasn't about how to better navigate harassment. It was about the profound importance of building systems where harassment cannot survive. Integrity is not merely a personal virtue. It is a structural necessity. It is the load-bearing wall of any institution that wields power over human lives. When it cracks, the entire structure is compromised. The story of Northwood was a testament to that. It showed that the slow, patient work of building trust and demanding accountability is the only true way to enforce the law and earn the consent of the governed. It is a fight that is never truly over, but one that must always be fought. What do you think is the most difficult part of changing an ingrained, toxic culture? Is it removing the bad actors, or is it winning the trust of those who remain? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We appreciate your support as we continue to bring you these stories.